Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello with Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we take you across the federal court system throughout the Great Plains and South Central United States, where federal prosecutors continue targeting major drug trafficker organizations, violent offenders, firearm crimes, child exploitation, organized crimes, and public corruption. From cartel leadership sentenced to life in prison to large-scale methamphetamine conspiracies, fentanyl trafficking, violent assaults, and fraud schemes, these cases demonstrate the broad scope of federal law enforcement during the month of July. Here is the federal crime report for this week. We begin tonight in Montana. Federal prosecutors in Montana announced several major narcotic prosecutions this month. In Billings, 41-year-old Joshua Mark Rideshore was sentenced to 9 years and 5 months in federal prison after investigators discovered he was distributing methamphetamine from his home. Authorities recovered approximately 4 ounces of methamphetamine, nearly $10,000 in cash, and a stolen Smith-Wesson handgun from after U.S. Marshals arrested Rideshore on an outstanding warrant. Because of prior felony convictions, he was prohibited from possessing a firearm. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, Amanda Lynn Montoya of Columbus and Christina Dallas Cruz of Helena pled guilty to separate methamphetamine trafficking charges connected to transporting narcotics from Washington to Montana. Both women face a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison and are scheduled to be sentenced in November. Federal prosecutors also announced that Whitley's Lori Amari Miller, a Missouri woman connected to a Chicago-based drug trafficking organization, pled guilty to illegally distributing oxycodone obtained from Montana pharmacies. She faces up to 20 years in federal prison when sentenced later this year. Next, we head to North Dakota. A violent offender from the Spirit Lake Reservation has been sentenced to federal prison. 34-year-old Kobe J. McKay, also known as Kobe Woods, received 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to assault with a dangerous weapon, strangulation involving a dating partner, and voluntary manslaughter. Federal prosecutors say McKay attacked a woman by placing a knife to her throat before strangling her until she nearly lost consciousness. Just weeks later, McKay killed Monte Ray Herman Sr. during a separate confrontation before fleeing the reservation. His disappearance prompted tribal leaders to issue a community curfew while law enforcement searched for him. Continuing to South Dakota, federal courts in South Dakota hand down lengthy prison terms involving firearms and fentanyl. In Pierre, Ty Bugler of Fort Thomas received 7 years in federal prison after firing a handgun towards multiple victims during an altercation on the Crow Creek, Sussex reservation. Fortunately, no one was struck by the gunfire. Meanwhile, in Rapid City, John Parado of Arizona was sentenced to 21 years and 10 months for conspiring to distribute more than 400 grams of fentanyl throughout the western South Dakota. Investigators determined much of the deadly drug supply entered the state throughout the United States mail. Now, we move to Nebraska. Federal authorities in Omaha dismantled a sophisticated methamphetamine operation operating from a rented Airbnb property. After receiving a tip from the property owner, investigators uncovered an illegal laboratory designed to proceed methamphetamine hidden within other compounds. Officers seized approximately 48 kilograms of pure methamphetamine during the investigation. 3 defendants, Ricardo Garanza Castillo, Eric Lavando Caraba, and Helerando Lavrada Castello, were each sentenced to 168 months in federal prison. In a separate case, Clifford Josts pled guilty to burglary committed within Santee Sussex Reservation. Federal investigators relied upon surveillance footage, cell phone records, Facebook evidence, Snapchat communication, and Verizon data to link them to a string of burglaries involving stolen vehicles and other property. Sentencing is scheduled for October. Next, we head to Kansas. Federal prosecutors in Kansas reported significant child exploitation and explosive cases. In Topeka, convicted sex offender Joshua Craig Abdil was sentenced to 151 months in federal prison for possession of child sexual abuse material. The sentence was followed by an FBI investigation after concealed storage containers discovered on wooded property contained computers and electronic devices holding more than 28,000 illegal images and 850 videos depicting child sexual abuse. Because Abdil was already serving supervised release for a previous federal child pornography conviction, the court imposed an additional consecutive 5-year sentence. Meanwhile, in Wichita, Adam Garcia received 126 months in federal prison after selling fentanyl, cocaine, and homemade pipe bombs to an undercover ATF agent. Authorities recovered more than 316 grams of fentanyl, cocaine, and 3 explosive devices during the investigation. Several additional conspirators have already been sentenced or are awaiting sentencing. We continue to Oklahoma. Federal prosecutors in Oklahoma City have unsealed an indictment charging Colin Shane Kirby, age 37, with distributing a synthetic opioid that allegedly resulted in a fatal overdose. According to prosecutors, Kirby distributed a substance known as cryphenyline in December of 2025. If convicted, Kirby faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison with possibility of life imprisonment. The investigation remains ongoing. Now we move into Texas. Perhaps most significant federal sentencing this month involves one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers, Ismael El Mayo. Zaramba Garcia, co-founder of the Sinaloa cartel, was sentenced to life in federal prison and ordered to forfeit $15 billion in criminal proceedings. Federal prosecutors described Zambada as one of the principal artifacts of a criminal organization responsible for trafficking enormous quantities of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into the United States for nearly 4 decades. Authorities say the cartel also built an extensive money laundering network, moving billions of dollars in illegal profits across international borders. Also in Texas, Dalla Ray Terrell, also known as Goo Ray, received 220 months in federal prison after investigators connect him to a large-scale fentanyl trafficking in Austin. Police initially encountered Terrell after he accidentally shot himself while handling a firearm. Subsequent investigation uncovered thousands of fentanyl pills, multiple firearms, including one equipped with a machine gun conversion device, and evidence linking Terrell to a fatal fentanyl overdose. Finally, we conclude in Louisiana. Federal prosecutors in Louisiana announced several noteworthy criminal cases. 19-year-old Oscar Virago Vega, a Honduran national unlawfully presented in the United States, was federally indicted after deputies allegedly uncovered him carrying a loaded handgun during July 4th investigation. In another case, former contract email carrier Michael O'Neill Carpenter pled guilty to stealing U.S. mail while transporting packages between postal facilities. His sentencing is scheduled for October. Finally, following a 5-day federal jury trial, Dale Sanders, a Kenner pastor, was convicted of 25 federal counts involving wire fraud, access device fraud, and obstruction of federal investigation. Prosecutors provided Sanders diverted more than $340,000 for a church account to finance gambling, dining, and other personal expenses before submitting falsified records during the federal investigation. He now awaits sentencing. Those are some of the most significant federal criminal prosecutions announced across the Great Plains and South Central United States during the past several weeks. From cartel leadership and major narcotic trafficking to violent crimes, firearm offenses, child exploitation, fraud, and public corruption, federal investigators continue pursuing complex criminal organizations operating across state and international borders. For continued coverage of the nation's most significant federal criminal cases, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Federal Crime Report. Have a good night and stay safe.